April 14, 1945, Friedrichsroda, Germany. When Captain Harold E. Watson of the United States Army Air Forces pushed open the massive doors of the Gottheimer Wagenfabrik Assembly Hall, he stopped mid-stride. His team from the Technical Intelligence Unit had been racing across collapsing Germany for weeks, cataloging aircraft factories before the Soviets arrived. But nothing had prepared them for this. Sitting on the factory floor was an aircraft that looked like it had been pulled from a future war. No tail, no fuselage in the conventional sense. Just a smooth, sweeping wing that stretched 16 meters across, painted in a mottled camouflage that seemed to absorb the dim factory light. The shape was all wrong, or perhaps too right, too clean, too modern. Watson had flown P-51 Mustangs and seen every fighter in the Luftwaffe's arsenal shot down over Europe. He'd examined captured Me-262 jets and thought those were revolutionary. But this was something else entirely. His engineering officer, Captain Robert Strobel, circled the aircraft slowly, running his hands over the plywood skin. "No tail surfaces at all," he muttered. "How does it even maintain stability?" In the corner of the hangar sat two more airframes in various stages of completion, and scattered documents covered in calculations that would take weeks to translate. Within hours, Watson's discovery would trigger a scramble involving the highest levels of the U.S. military. Within months, it would be crated up and shipped to America for secret testing. Within decades, it would be called the world's first stealth aircraft. But standing in that factory in the dying days of the Third Reich, Watson could only wonder, what had the Germans been building? And more troubling, what would have happened if they'd finished it 6 months earlier? By late 1943, the Luftwaffe faced an existential crisis. Allied bombing raids were devastating German cities with near impunity. During the Big Week Offensive in February 1944, the U.S. 8th Air Force flew over 3,000 bomber sorties deep into Germany. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had at these formations: FW-190s, Bf-109s, even the new Me-262 jets when they became available. But the bombers kept coming. The problem was simple physics. Conventional piston engine fighters needed to get close, within 200 meters, to effectively attack bombers with their machine guns and cannons. This meant running a gauntlet of defensive fire from B-17 gunners. Even when German fighters reached the bombers, their attacks were increasingly disrupted by American P-51 Mustang escorts. The Luftwaffe was losing experienced pilots faster than it could train replacements. In the first quarter of 1944 alone, Germany lost over 1,000 fighter pilots killed or seriously wounded. The Me-262 jet fighter offered one solution: speed. At 870 kilometers per hour, it could outrun any Allied fighter. But jet engines consumed fuel at an alarming rate, giving the Me-262 less than an hour of flight time. And it remained vulnerable during takeoff and landing when its speed advantage disappeared. Between November 1944 and war's end, Allied fighters destroyed dozens of Me-262s simply by patrolling their airfields. But there was another problem that few were talking about: radar. British chain-home radar stations could detect German bombers from 160 kilometers away. American SCR-270 radar sets defended Allied positions across Europe. The Luftwaffe knew the Allies were developing airborne interception radar that would make night and bad weather operations nearly impossible. Any future aircraft would need to evade not just visual detection, but electronic eyes as well. The global jet race was accelerating. In Britain, Frank Whittle's W2 engine had powered the Gloucester Meteor into service by July 1944. The Americans were working on the P-80 Shooting Star, which would fly in January 1944. The Germans had the Me-262 operational, but plagued by engine reliability issues. The Japanese were developing their own Nakajima Kika jet. Everyone was chasing speed. But the Horten brothers were chasing something else: invisibility. The engineering challenge was formidable. A flying wing, an aircraft with no distinct fuselage or tail, offered theoretical advantages. Less drag meant more speed and range from the same engine. Less surface area meant less radar reflection. But it also meant radical instability. Conventional aircraft used tail surfaces to maintain stability in all three axes: pitch, roll, and yaw. Remove the tail, and you remove the primary stabilizing force. Dozens of flying wing experiments had ended in crashes. Alexander Lippish's tailless designs showed promise, but most required huge vertical stabilizers that negated the stealth benefits. Then there were the practical problems. Germany in 1944 was desperately short of aluminum and strategic materials. Any new fighter would need to be built primarily from wood and steel tube, hardly ideal materials for an advanced jet aircraft. The Junkers Jumo 004 engines that powered the Me-262 were temperamental beasts, prone to flameouts and requiring replacement after just 25 hours of operation. And there was no time. The Reich was collapsing. Whatever flew would need to be combat-ready within months, not years. Enter Reimar and Walter Horten, two brothers who had been obsessing over flying wing designs since the 1930s. Reimar, the elder at 32, was the aerodynamicist and visionary. Walter, 28, was the test pilot and practical engineer. They'd built a series of gliders, the Ho-I through Ho-4, proving that tailless wings could fly stably if designed correctly. Their Ho-3 glider had won competitions and impressed Luftwaffe officials with its efficiency and handling. But the brothers were outsiders. They weren't part of the established aircraft manufacturers like Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf. Reimar was soft-spoken and theoretical, more comfortable with calculations than factory politics. He believed absolutely that the flying wing was aerodynamically superior to conventional designs. Not just marginally, but fundamentally. A conventional aircraft, he once explained, carries its weight in the fuselage, but generates its lift in the wings. This is inefficient. The wing should do both. In early 1943, Hermann Göring issued a requirement that seemed impossible: the Treacher 1000 Fowler specification. Any new bomber must carry 1,000 kilograms of bombs over 1,000 kilometers at 1,000 kilometers per hour. Conventional designs couldn't meet all three requirements simultaneously, but Reimar Horten ran the calculations and realized a flying wing powered by two jet engines could do it. Barely. He submitted a proposal for the Ho-9, later redesignated Ho-229, under RLM naming conventions. Göring, desperate for miracle weapons, approved development in March 1943. The brothers faced immediate opposition from establishment engineers who considered flying wings aerodynamic curiosities, not practical combat aircraft. But they had one advantage. Göring's direct support meant they could bypass normal channels. They were given a small team, minimal resources, and a workshop at Göttingen. Walter looked at his brother after receiving approval and said simply, "Now we have to make it work." Before we continue, let me know in the comments, had you heard about the Ho-229 before this video? And what other secret WW2 projects would you like to see covered? If you're enjoying this deep dive, hit subscribe. These stories require serious research, and your support makes them possible. The Horten brothers' design was radically simple and profoundly complex at the same time. From above, the Ho-229 looked like a giant bat wing, a smooth curve with a 16.8-meter wingspan, and a span-to-length ratio that made it wider than it was long. The center section was thickened to house the cockpit, fuel tanks, and two Junkers Jumo 004B turbojet engines. But there was no distinct fuselage. The pilot sat in a bubble canopy that bulged slightly from the wing's leading edge. The engines were buried in the wing roots, their intakes recessed to minimize drag. What made the design extraordinary was how the Hortens achieved stability without a tail. They used two innovations. First, they gave the wing a bell-shaped lift distribution. The center section produced more lift than the tips, creating a self-stabilizing effect. Second, they swept the wing back at 32 degrees. This sweep moved the center of lift backward, which naturally balanced the aircraft. For control, they used elevons, combined elevator and aileron surfaces on the wing's trailing edge, and a single large drag rudder for yaw control. The airframe was built from a welded steel tube center section covered with plywood. The outer wings were wooden, constructed from layers of plywood sandwiched around a wooden frame. This wasn't just about material shortages. Reimar believed wood absorbed radar waves better than metal. The entire surface was covered with a mixture of sawdust, charcoal, and glue. Some historians debate whether this was intentional radar-absorbing material or simply a standard wood putty. Post-war testing suggests it did reduce radar returns, though whether by design or accident remains disputed. The specifications were impressive. Two Jumo 004B engines producing 900 kilograms of thrust, each would push the aircraft to a projected top speed of 977 kilometers per hour at 12,000 meters, faster than any Allied fighter except possibly the P-80, which wasn't yet operational. Range was estimated at 1,900 kilometers, enough to strike targets deep in Allied territory and return. The Ho-229 would carry either two Mk-108 30mm cannons or a single 1,000-kilogram bomb. Its operational ceiling of 15,000 meters would put it above most Allied bombers. But the real innovation was the shape itself. The smooth curves and lack of vertical surfaces meant radar waves would reflect away rather than back toward the receiver. The wing's leading edge was angled to deflect radar. The engine intakes were recessed and shielded. In an era before computers could calculate radar cross-sections, the Hortens were using intuition and wind tunnel testing to create what modern engineers would recognize as a low observable design. The first prototype, designated Ho-9 V1, was a glider built to test the aerodynamics. Completed in March 1944, it looked nearly identical to the final jet design but lacked engines and armament. Walter Horten himself test flew it, towed to altitude behind a Messerschmitt Bf 110. The flights revealed both promise and problems. The aircraft handled smoothly in most conditions, with gentle stall characteristics and reasonable control response. But it was unstable at low speeds and required constant pilot input to maintain heading. Based on V1 data, they began constructing the V2, the first jet-powered version. The addition of engines changed everything. The extra weight of the Jumo 004s required strengthening the center section. The engine exhaust temperatures reached 650 degrees Celsius, requiring heat-resistant materials around the tailpipes. Fuel lines had to be routed through the wing structure without creating stress points. Every decision was a compromise between aerodynamics, structures, weight, and the reality of German war production in 1944. Construction took 6 months. They built the V2 at Göttingen with a team of fewer than 40 workers, many of them conscripted laborers. Material shortages meant constant improvisation. When high-grade aluminum ran out, They used salvaged materials from damaged aircraft. When proper plywood adhesives disappeared, they experimented with alternatives. The V-2 was as much an exercise in creative scarcity as advanced engineering. On February 2, 1945, the Ho-9 V-2 was ready. Erwin Ziller, a Luftwaffe test pilot with experience on the Me-262, climbed into the cramped cockpit at Oranienburg Airfield north of Berlin. The canopy offered excellent visibility, but the controls felt foreign. Elevon sticks instead of conventional control columns, a primitive fly-by-wire system using cables and pulleys. At 10:47 a.m., Ziller advanced the throttles. The Jumo engines spooled up with their characteristic howl, and the Ho-229 accelerated down the runway. It lifted off after just 500 meters, notably shorter than the Me-262. Ziller climbed to 800 meters and made several circuits of the airfield. Ground observers reported the aircraft appeared stable and responsive. After 32 minutes, Ziller landed smoothly. His report was enthusiastic. The Ho-229 flew like a dream and felt more stable than the glider version, probably due to the engine's gyroscopic effect. Over the next 3 weeks, Ziller made 7 more test flights, progressively expanding the envelope. On one flight, he reached 795 kilometers per hour in level flight, the fastest any flying wing had ever flown. The aircraft demonstrated a climb rate of 22 meters per second, far superior to the Me-262. Control response was crisp, though the single drag rudder made tight turns difficult. Ziller reported that a pilot could master the unusual handling characteristics within a few hours. Then came February 18th. Ziller took off for what was planned as the 9th test flight. He climbed to 2,200 meters and began a series of turns. Witnesses on the ground heard one engine surge and then cut out completely. The asymmetric thrust from the remaining engine immediately yawed the aircraft hard to the left. Ziller fought the controls, trying to restart the dead engine while maintaining control with the single Elevon system that was never designed for asymmetric thrust. For 90 seconds, he almost saved it. The Ho-229 descended in a series of shallow turns, Ziller clearly trying to line up with a road for an emergency landing. But at 150 meters altitude, the remaining engine also failed, possibly starved of fuel by the violent maneuvering. The aircraft entered an uncontrolled spin. Ziller didn't eject. The Ho-229 had no ejection seat. The aircraft impacted nose first in a field 4 kilometers from the airfield. Ziller died instantly. He was 36 years old and had survived over 2,000 test flights. The accident investigation revealed the Jumo 04's familiar demons: flameouts caused by rapid throttle movements at high altitude. The engine's combustion chamber couldn't maintain stable burning during quick power changes. This was a known issue with early turbojets, but it was especially deadly in a tailless aircraft with limited yaw control. Conventional fighters could handle single-engine failures. The Ho-229, with its experimental flight control system, could not. The loss of V-2 and Ziller should have ended the program. It was now March 1945. Soviet forces were 60 kilometers from Berlin. Allied armies were crossing the Rhine. Germany was weeks from collapse. But the project continued, driven by bureaucratic momentum and desperate hope. The V-3 prototype was already 80% complete at the Gothaer Wagenfabrik in Friedrichroda. The V-3 incorporated lessons from the V-2 flights. It had a strengthened center section, improved engine mounting that isolated vibrations, and most critically, uprated Jumo 004C engines with better throttle response. It also added 2 Mk108 30mm cannons in the wing roots, making it a combat-capable fighter for the first time. total weight increased to 6,912 kilograms loaded, heavier than originally planned, but still lighter than a fully loaded Me-262. Production planning was underway for an eventual Ho-229A series. The Gothair wagon fabric was allocated resources to build 20 pre-production aircraft, with full production of 100 per month planned for late 1945. These numbers were pure fantasy, given Germany's collapsing industrial capacity, but they reflected the priority assigned to the project. Each Ho-229A would cost approximately 120,000 Reichsmarks. Expensive, but not prohibitively so compared to the Me-262's 150,000 Reichsmark price tag. But time had run out. By April 1945, Friedrich Rothe was in the path of the American advance. Factory workers began destroying documents and preparing to evacuate. The V-3 sat on the assembly floor, needing perhaps another 3 weeks of work before first flight. 2 more airframes, V-4 and V-5, were in earlier stages of construction. Little more than steel tube frames and wooden ribs. Then Captain Watson arrived. His team photographed everything, created the V-3 airframe, and shipped it to the United States along with tons of documents, blueprints, and component parts. The V-4 and V-5 airframes were left behind. They were later captured by Soviet forces, though their ultimate fate remains unknown. Watson's report to USAF headquarters emphasized the aircraft's unusual characteristics. This aircraft represents an entirely new approach to fighter design. Its radar reflection characteristics require immediate investigation. What the Allies didn't know at the time was how close they'd come to facing the Ho-229 in combat. If the V-2 hadn't crashed, if Ziller had survived, if the war had lasted another 6 months, the Ho-229 might have seen operational service. Reimar Horten later claimed that production aircraft could have been in squadron service by summer 1945. But military historians are skeptical. The single-engine handling problems would have required significant redesign. Pilot training for such an unconventional aircraft would have taken months, and the chronic shortage of JUMO engines was limiting Me-262 production. There were none to spare for the Ho-229. For the Luftwaffe pilots who might have flown it, the Ho-229 represented both hope and terror. Its speed would have made it nearly impossible for P-51s to intercept. Its ceiling would have let it dive on bomber formations from above. But the unreliable engines and difficult handling meant that every mission would be a calculated risk. And by April 1945, there were no experienced pilots left to take those risks. The veterans were dead or captured. The replacements were teenagers with 30 hours of flight training. Allied intelligence had picked up fragments of information about a flying wing jet throughout 1944, mostly from Luftwaffe prisoners who'd heard rumors. But they dismissed most reports as exaggerations or propaganda about the Messerschmitt P111111 or other experimental designs. The British Ministry of Aircraft Production maintained a file on German flying wing projects, but rated them as low priority compared to the Me-262 threat. American intelligence analysts noted references to Ho-229 in intercepted German communications, but couldn't determine what it was. The closest the Allies came to understanding the Ho-229 before its capture was a December 1944 RAF intelligence report based on interrogations of a captured Luftwaffe engineer. He described a jet-powered flying wing without vertical or horizontal tail surfaces, constructed primarily of wood, with estimated speed in excess of 600 miles per hour. The report was filed and apparently forgotten, buried under more immediate concerns about V-2 rockets and the Battle of the Bulge. When Captain Watson's report reached Wright Field in Ohio, it triggered immediate interest. Engineers at the Air Technical Service Command recognized that the Ho-229's design philosophy was radically different from anything Allied engineers were pursuing. The decision was made to reconstruct the V-3 to flight-ready condition and test it thoroughly. But the aircraft arrived in damaged condition, and German records were incomplete. Full reconstruction would take years. The Ho-229 V-3 arrived at Freeman Field, Indiana, in July 1945, then moved to Wright Field in Ohio. American engineers spent months simply documenting what they had. The wooden construction puzzled them. Why would the Germans use such primitive materials for an advanced jet? When they analyzed the sawdust charcoal glue coating, they found it absorbed radio waves in the radar bands used by Allied aircraft detection systems. Whether intentional or accidental, it worked. Wind tunnel testing began in 1946. The Ho-229's shape produced some surprising results. At high speeds, it had 37% less drag than a conventional jet fighter of similar weight. The bell-shaped lift distribution did create inherent stability, though it required careful control inputs from the pilot. Most significantly, radar reflection tests showed the aircraft had a radar cross-section roughly 40% smaller than contemporary fighters when viewed from the front, the most critical angle during intercept scenarios. But American engineers also identified fatal flaws. The single drag rudder provided inadequate directional control, especially at low speeds. The engine placement created severe yaw moments during single-engine operation, the problem that killed Ziller. The wooden structure, while radar transparent, was vulnerable to moisture and would deteriorate in harsh climates. And the swept wing, while aerodynamically efficient, created dangerous tip stall characteristics that could snap the aircraft into an unrecoverable spin. Test pilots who evaluated the reconstructed flight control system universally called it challenging. Without modern fly-by-wire computers, maintaining coordinated flight required constant pilot attention. Chuck Yeager, who reviewed the Ho-229 design in 1953, reportedly said, "The Germans were brilliant engineers, but this thing would have killed more Luftwaffe pilots than Allied gunners." The Ho-229 never flew in American hands. The cost of fully restoring V-3 to flight condition, including sourcing or replicating two Jumo 004 engines, was deemed excessive, given that the United States had captured dozens of intact Me-262s for testing. The V-3 airframe was placed in storage in 1950, where it remained for decades. But the Ho-229's influence was profound and subtle. Northrop Aircraft Corporation's Jack Northrop had been developing flying wing designs since the 1930s, independent of the Hortens. But when Northrop engineers examined the Ho-229 data in 1947-48, they found solutions to problems they'd been struggling with. The bell-shaped lift distribution became incorporated into the YB-49 flying wing bomber. The swept wing design influenced Northrop's thinking about stability and control. More significantly, the Ho-229 planted a seed in American military thinking. Stealth mattered. The concept that an aircraft could be designed from the beginning to minimize radar reflection, not as an afterthought, but as a primary design driver, was revolutionary. This wouldn't bear fruit until the 1970s, when Lockheed's Skunk Works began developing the Have Blue demonstrator that led to the F-117 Nighthawk. The F-117's faceted shape looked nothing like the smooth curves of the Ho-229, but the underlying principle was identical. Shape the aircraft to deflect radar away from the receiver. In 1983, Reimar Horten was interviewed by aviation historians and asked directly, "Was the Ho-229 designed as a stealth aircraft?" His answer was carefully worded. We knew that radar was becoming important. We knew that metal reflects radar waves. So we built the aircraft from wood and carbon, and we shaped it to be smooth. Was this stealth? We didn't use that word. But yes, we understood the principles. Modern radar cross-section modeling, conducted by Northrop Grumman engineers in 2008-09, confirmed that the Ho-229 would have been significantly harder to detect than conventional 1945 fighters. Against British chain-home radar operating at 20 to 30 mph, the reduction was minimal. Those low-frequency radars couldn't resolve individual aircraft anyway. But against the higher-frequency AI MiKi-V8 airborne interception radar used by British night fighters, the Ho-229 would have been detectable at only 80% of the normal range. In practical terms, this meant a night fighter that could normally spot a bomber at 8 kilometers would only detect the Ho-229 at 6.4 kilometers, enough to potentially break the intercept chain. Today, the Ho-229 V3 rests in the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center of the National Air and Space Museum in Chantilly, Virginia. It sits in the Mary Baker Engen Restoration Hangar, partially reconstructed, awaiting full conservation. The wooden wings show their age, warped and cracked in places. The steel tube center section has been stabilized but not restored. The empty engine nacelles stare out like hollow eyes. Next to it sits the only surviving Jumo 004 engine from the project, its turbine blades frozen in place after 80 years. It is the only surviving example of what might have been and what could have happened if the Horten brothers had been given more time, more resources, and a government not collapsing in flames around them. Museum visitors often walk past it without recognition, drawn instead to the flashier exhibits. The Enola Gay, the Space Shuttle Discovery, the SR-71 Blackbird. But aviation historians and engineers stop and stare, recognizing something profound. The Ho-229 represents one of those rare moments when engineering vision collides with historical necessity and produces something genuinely revolutionary, even if that revolution came too late to matter. The Horten brothers weren't trying to win a lost war. They were trying to prove an idea, that the flying wing was the future of aviation. They were right, though neither lived to see that future fully realized. Reimar died in 1993, Walter in 1998. Both saw the B-2 Spirit flying wing bomber enter service and recognized their work in its lines. The Ho-229 never delivered a bomb, never fired its cannons in anger, never even completed a combat-ready test flight. But it changed how engineers thought about aircraft design. It proved that stealth wasn't magic. It was physics and geometry. It showed that radical designs could work if the mathematics were sound. And it demonstrated that even in desperate circumstances, even in a collapsing evil regime, human ingenuity could create something that transcended the moment. Standing in that hangar in April 1945, Captain Watson couldn't have known he was looking at a thread that would run through aviation history for the next 80 years, from the YB-49 to the B-2, from Have Blue to the F-117, from the F-22 to the B-21 Raider. All of them are spiritual descendants of that strange, smooth wing sitting in a German factory while the Third Reich burned. The Ho-229 was a stealth jet in 1945, decades before the concept had a name. It was born of desperation, built from scraps, and died in the ruins of war. But its ghost still flies in the shape of every low observable aircraft that cuts through the sky unseen, invisible to the electronic eyes that search for it. What the Hortens created in that workshop in Göttingen wasn't just an aircraft. It was a glimpse of the future, built in the dying days of the past.